And all right, so we're good. So I push continue. There we go. But I am actually here as a private, non-affiliated, not a NOAA person on this particular call. And I think everyone understands that. It's less of an issue with this administration than with the previous one, but we need to be careful not to sort of, get out ahead of things. So anyway, and I'm gonna just burn through. I'm hoping it. I haven't actually given this particular talk before. I've made a bunch of changes even this morning. I'm gonna aim for about a half hour, and then we can have questions and so on. I've also changed the flavor slightly, so we'll get to that in a second. But this is so this is an image that many of you have seen, most of you have seen. This is the Earthrise image from the 1968 Apollo mission. I don't remember which number that was, but it was one of the first times that we actually saw the Earth, out there as this kind of vulnerable orb out there in space, and it kind of elevated people's consciousness about the planet. And so let me just do that. Whoops, hold on a second. How do I advance slides? There we go. But this planet of ours is running a fever. Kirk said there's a lot of docs on the call, so I'm going to try to insert some medical terminology in my presentation here. So this is looking back about 2,000 years. This is looking at proxy data, temperature data going through lake sediments and ice cores and tree rings and other ways of tracking temperatures. So you can see here, what's interesting is that you've got kind of what's actually a downward trend in global temperatures for much of the last 2,000 years, up until the last 150 or so years, which coincides with the start of the Industrial Revolution. And here you have the observed temperatures then from that Industrial Revolution period to the present, showing a pronounced uptick in global temperatures. And so you guys may know about Michael Mann, who's a fairly well-known climate scientist here in the country, and it's gotten a lot of attention. This is his hockey stick depiction, his hockey stick graph, which got a lot of attention from folks. And there's a lot of impacts that we're observing from this. So here you've got the Arctic sea ice extent. This is in the early 1980s. And here it is in, I think, 2012. And it's actually gotten a lot worse since then. I meant to add a more recent image, but the most recent images have summer sea ice, which is just kind of barely hugging the kind of Canadian islands and the Greenland, North Greenland coast up there. And it's not just ice extent, it's also thickness. So it's not only becoming, covering less area, it's also getting thinner, which means that it's weaker and easier to break up and more prone to be pushed around by the wind and broken up that way as well. So that is a lot of issues. So check this out. You guys probably have seen some of these, before and after images before, but this is Alaska in the 1880s. And look at that kind of caret symbol there in the screen. Focus on that. So this is 1880. This is 2005. Same exact view. So this just shows you the magnitude of the receding ice and warming that we're observing all over the planet. So that's up in Alaska. This is in the Andes in Peru. So here you've got 1970s. Lonnie Thompson has been doing these studies from Ohio State for decades, looking at montane glaciers around the planet. And here in 2011, so 1,600 years of ice formation has just passed away in 25. So and this is just a quick schematic that shows you kind of frequency. You've got kind of cooler than average, warmer than average, a nice little even bell curve there. This is showing you the 1950s to 1980, so a 30-year span. But now look at how the deviation has shifted. These are average global temperatures. So you can see the frequency of warmer than average is, and this is in the 1980s, is dwarfing the cooler than average. 1990s, that continues. And in the 2000s, it's going even farther, and it's even gone beyond this in the last decade, up to the 20 teens. So what we're seeing here is a very pronounced shift in temperatures, and this is observed through multiple independent lines of evidence. So this is not just a one-off. This is not thermometers on the ground, in the sea, in the air, measurements, satellites, balloons, planes, floats, buoys, gliders, ships, smartphones, seasonal frozen ground, whatever. They all show warming. So it's absolutely unequivocal. The question is why? So here we see solar activity actually has been declining in recent decades. So it's not the sun. I'm just going to cut to it. It's the atmosphere, right? It is that humans are effectively changing the composition of the atmosphere. We're changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, which is having provided effects on the planet. So I'm not going to belabor this one. You've all seen this. So we get our energy from the sun, passes through the atmosphere and warms the planet. Some of that radiates back out into space. Some of it's trapped by our atmosphere and warms the planet. This is all good. But what's happening is we are filling that same atmosphere with heat trapping greenhouse gases to the tune of 52 gigatons. That's 52 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases every year. So it's actually the highest level of greenhouse gases that we've had in our atmosphere in millions of years. It's mostly carbon dioxide, mostly from burning fossil fuels, but importantly, also a bunch of methane from agriculture and industry, as well as nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases. So while the CO2 is most of it, and that's important because CO2 is persistent. It sits in the atmosphere for centuries and millennia in some cases. And methane is far shorter lived, but it's also far more potent, has a greenhouse gas forcer, which means that it's much more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So those less prevalent, but much more potent gases are also highly concerning. And how are we doing this? So we're doing it through fossil fuel combustion. We just covered transportation, on the ground, in the air, agriculture, industrial agriculture around the planet, deforestation, conversion of forest land to agriculture, and then here are all the other sources of greenhouse gases. So, and here's a graphic that's showing you, again, going back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, the mid-19th century to the present, showing you the rise of emissions. So the net result is that blanket of atmosphere around the planet is thickening, and that is therefore trapping more heat, and that is warming the planet. And so as that CO2 increases, so does the temperature. So here again, this is what we started with, that hockey stick, the CO2 and the temperature lined up that shows you the relationship. But it's actually more interesting when you look a little further back. We can do proxy measurements back about 800,000 years, mostly through Antarctic ice cores for most of this. But here you can see CO2 gases, and they measure this through bubbles which are trapped in the ice. And so there you go. And you can see that it's basically, it's within a bound there between roughly 180 and 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And you can see that there's a direct correlation. I won't say causation because these are proxy measurements, but there's a strong correlation here that you can see an overlay between CO2 and temperature. Okay, but so the thing is, if you guys remember that movie Inconvenient Truth that Al Gore did a handful of years ago. So he had his famous moment in the film when he got on a little kind of riser on the screen and like dramatically lifted himself up the stage, to get high up to show you. So this actually is not the current concentration. This was from about 10 years ago. The current CO2 concentration is about 417 parts per million. So just since, I want to say 2014 or so, it's gone up about 17 parts per million. So that's actually an extraordinary acceleration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So, and this is business as usual. If we keep going as we are in 40 years, they project we'll be up about 600 parts per million. So we really can't go there as a society. So in the last slide, you saw that correlation of the temperature and CO2. Here they are kind of put together. This is for the last 400,000 years. This is Antarctica measurements, but again, showing you greenhouse gas and temperature overlaid. So you can see they really go in lockstep there. Okay, so all that's good. So we know that it's about a degree centigrade since the Industrial Revolution. All right, so where is that heat going? So most people don't know this, but over 90% of the excess heat on the planet is residing in the oceans. The oceans are taking it up, and they're basically insulating the life on the planetary surface from what could be a much more severe warming impact from all that excess energy. So the oceans are taking it up. And actually my lab in Seattle is one of the few labs in the world that is putting probes in the deep and the abyssal oceans. So that means between 2,000 and 6,000 meters of depth, and taking those heat measurements to close the global energy budget to understand where this excess heat's going. And the rest of it's in the atmosphere and elsewhere, but it's mostly in the ocean. So that's a very important point. And here's an actual chart showing you, now this isn't crazy amounts of heat, But this is, what we like to say is that since 1970, the amount of heat that the excess heat the Earth has absorbed in the oceans is the equivalent of all 7.5 billion inhabitants of the planet, everyone holding two of those 1970s era hair dryers that, the loud, wheezy things, holding two of those, running them continuously since 1970. Every person on the planet doing that continuously. That's how much heat we're talking about. That is, I don't know if that works for you, but that's showing you how much heat is there. And so that has a lot of impacts, that excess heat. So one of them is that it's energizing storms that form over the ocean, specifically, hurricanes and cyclones. And so here's a graphic showing you this is above average sea surface temperatures off the eastern seaboard here. This, of course, is October 20th, 2012, which is just before Hurricane Sandy hit. So Hurricane Sandy was one of those anomalous events that was basically feeding off that excess heat, supercharged by that anomalous sea surface heat, and slammed into New York City and did all those things. So, which today is now like, well, that's just like last month, right? I mean, it's just like suddenly what was this anomalous, like 1 in a 1,000-year event is becoming a much more commonplace phenomenon. But you can see the destruction of that event and similar events like it. Another impact of warming oceans is that they evaporate more moisture into the sky. And so, your classic hydrological cycle, evaporation, precipitation into the sea and back, is now on steroids. And so you get this basically supercharged cycle where you get these heavy precipitation days. This is worldwide data. And this has actually been further bumped up in the last 10 years or so. But you get these like supercell events like this, where the water, it's like they describe it like the drain of a bathtub, where you pull it out and down goes all the water in that one place. And that's crazy. And so you get these crazy flood events. And, when Kirk approached me about giving this talk, I was like, man, I got to give this talk because the West is on fire out here and the East is underwater. And like, I got to talk about this. This is in real time. We're all hitting it. So you don't have to go to India for that. But the point is that all that precip going in one place means that there isn't rain in another place. And so you also have these extremes. So weather extremes is a very, clear signature of the current changing climate. So then you get these drought events, which of course also lead to, increased fire risk. And so we all know about the fires that just, threw up South Lake Tahoe but this has been now in the last 20 years, a constant phenomenon, and we have air quality alerts here in Seattle, which never used to happen. And there's huge health impacts. So this is satellite imagery of fires in Sumatra, mostly set by palm oil plantation owners that are clearing forests to plant oil palm. And I mean, just incredible air quality events from all of this. And here's Beijing on a clear day and Beijing on a less clear day. Again, but again, you don't have to go to Beijing. You can go to Seattle, which is just crazy from the Space Needle, the same kinds of images. And the point is that we're on a accelerating train here. So climate models, so they know enough about planetary atmospheric circulation to know with some confidence, kind of under business as usual, emission scenarios, what things could look like going forward. So here's some model projections, and these aren't perfect, but they're illustrative, right? So here we are. These are actual measurements of the first decade of the 21st century, drought conditions. So you can see drier is the kind of more, colorful, brighter, warmer colors, and then the wetter are the blue family. So now we're fast forwarding 30 years, and what you see is that the breadbaskets of the world, so the Mediterranean and the central United States and Mexico, are getting very much drier under the business as usual scenarios. And this then just continues into the 2060s and then on to the 2090s. So you can see that by the 2090s, under current emission scenarios, the Mediterranean is basically done as a rain-fed agriculture region. And the central US could also be, in that kind of same scenario. Now, people say, well, we'll just go to Canada to grow our corn, but that's false. Like, have you ever been to Canada? I mean, it's the Canadian Shield, it's bedrock, right? All the Canadian soil was pushed down to Iowa by the glaciers. So the soil is here. The growing conditions are here. They're not up there. Also, the days are different, the light's different, all things are different. So you can't just move north. So that's an important lesson. So another huge thing to think about is sea level. So you all know sea levels are only going one direction, right? So this is just, again, from the late 1800s to the present. And what you want to note here is, and this isn't a huge, so we're talking about 150 millimeters, which if you see my little ruler here, it's just this much. It's like my thumb. That's not, across the whole planet. It's not a ton, right? But it's significant globally, and I'll show you in a minute why. But the most important thing here is to look at the rate of rise, which has gone from less than a tenth of a millimeter a year to now 3 millimeters a year. Or sorry, 9/10 of a millimeter a year up to 3. So this is accelerating, and that should be concerning, because what we know is that, again, like I said, it's one direction. And so there's new estimates, new projections, and they're actually, I've got more recent estimates than this 2007 one. But you can see that, like, we're looking at conservatively now, under business as usual scenarios, a meter plus of sea level rise by 2100. And what you want to note there is that the curve is going, look at the slope of that, right? So it's not like one of these things where it's going to easily bend over. It's going in one direction for a while. And so I think that's just something we need to be aware of. And there's a huge concern also with warming oceans, because here you have Antarctica. And what's significant here is the ice shelves that ring the continent, the marine ice sheets that are basically holding the land ice back from flowing into the ocean. It's like, think of corks in a bottle, right? So there's corks all the way around the Antarctic coastline, right, that are holding that land ice, keeping it on land. Well, this warming ocean actually undermines, it actually goes under these ice sheets and is melting them from below. So they're getting hammered from above by rising air temperature, and they're getting more hammered from below. And so they're actually starting to disintegrate from below. So I'm almost done with giving you the doom and gloom story, and then we're going to talk about better stuff. But just adding sea levels now to these different data sets. So at the top, you've got the temperature anomaly. In the middle, you've got the CO2 concentration. Again, this is going back 400,000 years. So we've already just seen this in the previous slides. And you can kind of see some reference points of, just epochs in time. But the thing we've added now is sea level. And so what you see here is, with that same 100 or so parts per million differential in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, you see 100 meters of sea level differential corresponding with that 100 parts per million. So that is a very important thing to take note of, especially when you look at the CO2 concentration on the right side. You can see that last bump of CO2 concentration. We're way off the charts. We're way outside the recent bounds of earthly experience in terms of this. So we are truly pushing the system in a way that the system will respond, I think, quite aggressively if we don't aggressively stop pushing the system with changing the atmospheric chemistry. There's other changes also that are less obvious. So one thing that our lab studies, I don't know if you guys have heard of Dick Feely, Richard Feely out at the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab. He's down the hallway from me here, but he's the godfather of ocean acidification. So he's the first scientist really that got out, a chemist that got out there and started to observe the changes in ocean chemistry, and also the impacts of those changes on the ecosystem, on the food web, on shelled organisms, and so on. So the point is that even if you're able to somehow address the atmospheric issue, the oceans are taking up huge amounts of atmospheric carbon and converting it to carbonic acid and changing the chemistry of the oceans, which are having huge impacts. So a bunch of global systems have vulnerable to this, and I'm almost done on the impacts. So farming in hell, farming conditions have become much more dicey and variable in many parts of the world. So water, we're a thirsty species, right? We just consume water like crazy, mostly agriculture. Here's kind of a remote sensing view of irrigated land in Saudi Arabia, showing you the huge volume of water that's used. Anyway, this is Kansas. So we're depleting this water. This is Ogallala Aquifer fossil water that's been used up. So huge disruptions there. And of course, disease. So we got, global warming, there's winners and losers. Everyone talks about there's winners and losers. Well, a lot of the winners, it turns out, are the pests that we actually don't want to win, from our perspective. And so you get these diseases and so on. But pivot point, we do have the solutions at hand. And I actually personally am convinced, having, someone who's exposed to the science every day, I'm still convinced, despite all of what I've just presented, that we do have the solutions and the technology we need at our fingertips to get going on this now. And I'm going to quickly burn through some of that. And I actually will, despite everything I've just shown you, I'll leave you on a hopeful note. So there's two ways to think about it. One is managing the unavoidable and avoiding the manageable, right? So managing the unavoidable is, we already live in a global warming, changed climate, right? It's already here now. We see it every day. And so we need to adapt to it. So, but we can do it smartly, and we can do it in a way which minimizes impacts and actually maximizes opportunities, those opportunities that come with a warming planet. So we can capitalize on those. But the real thing here, and that's important, but the real thing is avoiding the unmanageable, which is, stopping the pollution, reducing the emissions, getting onto a clean energy economy, boosting natural sinks for capturing, pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere, and also changing how we live as a global society. All right. So I'm going to burn through these very quickly. I'm glad to talk more in questions about any of these, but there's lots of adaptation strategies that we can bring to bear. This is just a very small sub list of them. There's many more, but like, genetics and genetic research on coming up with heat or drought tolerant crops that can actually do well in these different conditions. Knowing where to plant, and if you know kind of what the weather is going to be, what the extremes are going to look like with enough lead time, you can plant accordingly. Storing and saving water that comes in those bursts and then doesn't come again for months, but having that then conserved so that you can still access it when the water isn't there. Get out of the harm's way, like stop building in flood and fire zones, put the incentives in place to get people out of those places. Strengthen your infrastructure. That's both hardening your power grid, for example, but also softening, planting seagrasses and salt marshes and allowing, nature to kind of do its own defenses, which often work a lot better than the ones that we engineer. And then also giving nature a hand, putting in place migration corridors, protecting refugia species. So all that's adapting, but the real game here that we need to engage is stopping the pollution, reducing carbon emissions to zero as quickly as possible. So the good news is there's a lot of ways to do this today, right? So efficiency, the US could cut its use in half today with today's technology through efficiencies alone, through retrofitting buildings and homes with different windows, with different heating and cooling systems, with smart systems that turn off and on when you come and go, and grids which have more flexibility, can move power more effectively and can store that power and save it for when it's actually needed, and more efficient closed loop processes with industry and so on. Those are quick early wins. We could do that. But ultimately, we also, along with that, have to shift our production to clean energy. And it's also, as it turns out, a lot cheaper to use clean and renewable energy sources than it is traditional fossil fuel. So we use energy for lots of reasons. So we plug in stuff, electricity, agriculture, transportation, industry, buildings. You get a sense. It's about half electricity and agriculture, and the other half transportation and making stuff and heating and cooling houses. And also it turns out just fossil fuel energy production is hugely intensive in terms of fugitive emissions and refineries and other processes. So that's kind of the overview. In the US, this is in 2010, so it's shifted a little bit, but this is the overview of how we powered our country, our economy. And that's pretty much how we do still now. But the bottom line is it's about 85% fossil fuels. I think the natural gas is bumped up since this graph was done. The coal is bumped down a little bit, but it's roughly the same, 85, with the remaining 50 split between nuclear and renewables. And renewables include solar, wind, and wave, and geothermal, and whatnot. Okay, so that's kind of the current energy picture, but that's what we need to flip. And people talk about natural gas. You guys are kind of in the fracking part of the world, right? I mean, I guess not in New York State, but in Pennsylvania, your neighbor to the south, they've been fracked to hell, right? So, and everybody says, well, it's clean, right? I even saw a billboard this morning dropping my kids to school that like, clean natural gas. Well, guess what? It's clean, but it's actually not awesomely clean. It's about, maybe it's a little less, than a little more than half of the CO2 imprint that the coal delivers. So it's cleaner than coal, but compared to renewables and everything, it's they talk about a bridge, right? Natural gas is the bridge fuel. It's not the end game here. The end game has to be to get out of gas altogether, get out of carbon altogether. There's been a huge wave against coal. Coal's become anathema, it's become too expensive. And that's even without internalizing the actual societal costs of burning that coal. We haven't even gotten there yet. And they're still closing down because they're not profitable. So that's positive. And there's all sorts of renewable energy. I mean, all over the world, there's wind farms, Kenya, Turkey, Morocco, India has all these goals to aggressively ramp up their solar. China's on fire, Mexico, all the United States, you see these wind farms. Iowa, the state of Iowa, which is, it's a purple state, it's a red state, it's a purple state, it's more of a red state. 57% of their power in 2020 was wind, right? Highest of any state in the country, strong bipartisan support, and it's profitable. And why? Because there's a state law that says that the utilities have to purchase a certain quantity of their power from wind, right? So it's a law. That's all it took, was one law to put that in place. They'll put a bunch of tax incentives and breaks and whatever rebates, but one law basically put it together because it gave the wind energy the long-term prospect of a sustained customer base. And that's one of the things with renewables that we don't have. Anyway, solar also taking off all over the country, all over the world, sorry, Vatican. And it's not just, the huge solar farms, it's at every level. These are kind of concentrated solar powers where these are mirrors that are pointing all the sunlight at this like hot water tank that's boiling, and then that's how you make the power. So there's all sorts of cool things going on. And in terms of like a planetary response, you do have things like this, which is an imagined thing that doesn't exist yet, but it could, where you've got, this interconnected grid of renewable, energy sources across Europe and Africa, North Africa, which could potentially provide all the power for that entire part of the world. So production of photovoltaics is off the charts. China in particular, like I said, is a huge lead on that. And solar installations are in the US are also growing dramatically. And as a result of that, the costs are coming way down. And like I said earlier, it's actually more cost effective to put in a new renewable energy facility than it is to build a coal power plant, a lot cheaper. And Sandy McDonald, who used to head the Earth Systems Lab in Boulder that I used to work with, actually put together an American supergrid plan, a proposal, which he put forward to the US government, but wasn't taken up, but basically had us, transitioning to over 90% renewable energy in this country by the 2030s. And he did it by this supergrid, which allowed us to, because the big problem with renewables is that, you need the power when it's night and the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. And that's the myth that you hear about why renewables aren't going to work. And there is truth to it. But if you have the ability to put in low loss transmission lines that actually hold the power over the distance and improved battery capacity, which is going to hold that power for when it's needed, and those advances are here. I mean, we can do this. So the point is the barriers are not technological. I should say they are a little bit financial because there is an upfront capital cost for doing this, but it's a political problem mostly. So clean energy, you get rid of, a key driver of global warming, you reduce air pollution, which kills a bunch of people, you create jobs, you provide long-term price stability. Okay, so we need to start this conversion right away. It's going to take time. The longer you wait, the more costly it gets. But also reducing emissions won't be enough. So another thing I'm going to talk about really quick is sinks. So sinks basically is referred to, if emissions are sources of carbon going in the atmosphere, sinks are nature's way of taking that carbon out of the atmosphere. And so there's a bunch of sinks to talk about, but stopping deforestation, increasing reforestation, planting grasslands, which pull that up and lock it in the soil, changing your ag practices, pulling our carbon dioxide out of the water, engineered sinks, and you're starting to see more of these kind of like big machine kind of things that are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. None of that's at scale yet, and it takes time. But we also are talking more and more about this, geoengineering or climate engineering, which you guys have heard about. That comes in two forms, two flavors. So first is solar radiation management, which is effectively throwing sulfates, basically, sulfur dioxide, volcanic eruption equivalent amounts into the high atmosphere to basically, reflect sunlight back out into space so it doesn't hit the earth in the first place to warm us. So that's one idea. And actually NOAA is part of a team that's researching those scenarios. And then the other is capturing the carbon and sequestering it, like we just talked about it. But there's some big problems here. First is the scalability of it, actually doing it at a scale which is commensurate with the problem. There's a lot of unintended consequences. What does it mean if you are reducing, the albedo on the Earth, like the amount of solar radiation hitting the Earth? What does that mean for a lot of things? We don't know. And it also, most importantly, doesn't address the core problem. We still have pollution, which also doesn't fix the ocean acidification problem in the oceans and other things. So it may be a bridge to helping avoid the worst catastrophic impacts, but it's not really a long-term thing. But here's the point, right? Even with all this, like, stay positive, because there's actually a lot of reason for hope. So in the last half century, humans are healthier, women are having fewer children, children are healthier as a result. The world's far more educated and literate. I think the literacy rate in the world is something in the order of like 85, 86% today. We're more mobile, we're more connected, we're less violent. Population growth is coming down. So the success stories are everywhere, and the future is really ours to choose, and we can make it a good one, but that really depends on stopping climate change. I give talks all over the place, and someone said, what are the main issues? Like, I want to talk about healthcare, I want to talk education, I want to talk about, what are the issues on the table? And I said, you know what? Climate change is the table. Like, everything kind of rests on our planetary weather and climate system. So you can't fix really anything else in any kind of long-term way without addressing the climate. So we have to do this. So what can you do, right? What can you guys do as a bunch of retired docs out in Ithaca? I don't know, but here you go, right? So we need accelerators. They call them accelerators. These are the drivers for change. So, and it's an all the above approach. So you need to change the laws and regulations, incentives in the tax structure, which will incentivize weaning us off of this carbon, fossil fuel driven economy. You need to shift capital around. You need to invest it, strategically in the places where it's going to have the greatest impact for spinning up the new industry, and philanthropy has to follow suit. Business practices have to do, they have to be responsible. They've got to be incentivized to be responsible. They've got to, come up with and adhere to standards and goals which clean up their business. Technology is huge investment need in technology and innovation for scaling up some of those solutions that I've talked about. And people have to change a lot of things about kind of how they live. And those are small things, but they do add up, right? We do have to engage our leaders. There's a real absence. There's a crisis of leadership around this issue. And I'm very pleased to see the current administration taking it seriously, and people, starting to put resources into things where they're needed. But we've really lacked that vision, and we've lost a lot of valuable time in terms of this issue and how to address it. So I think you need to communicate with your political leaders at all levels, whether that's your Ithaca election today or whoever, Boston, all the way up to, the administration and the people that are setting the priorities that others will follow. There are a lot of win-wins out there, a lot of co-benefits with cleaning up our energy system, cleaner air, water, jobs. Don't be afraid to speak out. I'm gonna bump through this really quick. There's no silver bullet. People say, well, all we need to do is plant 1 trillion trees and we're good. And that's not true. That's actually a lie, right? I mean, it's there, it's part of the solution, but you need everything. It's silver buckshot, right? It has to be behavior change with conservation, efficiency, waste reduction, low carbon system with adaptation. It all has to be done together. It's a powerful toolbox done together, but it has to be done together, all of it. And the point is that it can be done. Like we know how to do this, and but it will take time. So we've got to get busy, because it's decades of investment and transition that we have to do. So I want to end on a kind of a positive note. I don't know if you guys can see what's at the top of the screen there, but it's basically, it's the opportunities with climate change. It's actually an opportunity, if you think about it, to kind of reboot the planet, right? A planet that kind of has been designed by default rather than by design, right? We've just kind of fallen into things and kind of done things a certain way for a while, and then figured it out and moved on. But we know better now, right? So, and it's an opportunity also when you're kind of booting the planet, reimagining society and how we do things. It's an opportunity to address other issues that are also connected to how we distribute resources. There's a huge jobs opportunity to replace jobs lost to globalization. You can create healthier cities where people can walk around and just live healthier lives. The point is that we need visionary leaders. And so I wanted to end just on a little kind of plea to you guys. So you guys have influence in your communities. You know, you're respected leaders in your, you know, communities of faith, in your schools, in your, you know, in neighborhoods, wherever it is. You're respected as leaders, and people will listen to you. They go to you for help. And I think you have an opportunity here. You actually, and you have time. I mean, I think you're mostly retired, all retired, I don't know, but you've got some time on your hands, which is something that people like me and people, we don't have the time to do what needs to be done on this. You guys do. So I'm just saying, I think there's actually kind of a cool opportunity here. Maybe some of you guys are deep into this issue already and working locally on different things. And I'd love to hear about what you guys are doing. But we really do have an opportunity here to make this planet a better place. So there's a few links for more resources here. One on kind of the science of climate change, one on renewable energy, and the other on specific solutions. So this last one is really cool, this drawdown.org site. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. Paul Hawken, who I've met, who is one of these kind of deep ecological thinkers that's been around a long time. But he came up with Project Drawdown, which is basically an all the above approach focused on solutions for drawing down. Drawdown refers to the drawdown point in the emissions curve. So drawing down emissions from the current growth curve to the other side of the curve and eventually bringing us down to zero emissions. So, and the last note is just to go back to where we started. We got one planet. Let's do the best we can with it. So I'm done. So thanks for listening. And I'm glad to Esther, I know it's almost 11 o'clock here on my time, so you guys are almost done, but let me know if, I'm glad to chat for a few minutes.
Jamie, why don't you screen share so that we can
yes, stop screen
each
share.
other on gallery.
Yep, there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Much.
Yeah.
Jamie, I had a question. What's the real magnitude of energy savings? I know there'll be some emission improvements with electric cars and electric vehicles, but from just a raw power standpoint, as far as joules per mile, is there a significant savings with electric vehicles versus petroleum power?
Well, yes, although I will say it depends. So it depends on where your power is coming from. That's firing up that car. So if it's a coal power plant that's fueling your car, you know. But I will say I like to talk about co-benefits, right? So even if you are pulling from a dirty energy source for your car's power that you plug in at night, you're still not emitting emissions when you drive down the street. Right. So there's co-benefits in terms of, you know, public health and ambient air quality and a lot of other things. I do think it's still cleaner even if you're pulling from a dirty source. Because like I said, the refinery process for converting, you know, crude oil to drivable gasoline is incredibly energy intensive and polluting just in itself. So I think you're still better off with the electric car. We'll all be much better off once we get the power grid off of fossil fuels and onto renewables, and then we'll have done it. So, but drive electric, you've got an electric car, it's great.
I mean, can you say a word about nuclear power?
Yeah, so I think the big concern with nuclear power beyond the safety issue, which I think has been actually, in my opinion, I'm not a nuclear physicist or an expert on any of this, but I would say it's been a little bit overblown. I think that we got alarmed by 3 Mile Island in the late 70s here. I think we got alarmed by Chernobyl, which was a crappy design of a not very well-maintained facility. And so we had these events which now suddenly, you know, the anti-nuke movement in the world kind of turned on it, and they could never get the financing to build new plants. So we're basically in the United States working off of plants that were built 30 years ago in most cases. And I think in almost all cases. I mean, I don't know of a new nuclear plant that's come online recently. So, so nuclear, I think, is really actually good. It's not perfect. I mean, the waste from nuclear waste is the kicker, right? What do you do with that stuff? It's persistent. It lasts for, you know, on geological timelines. So you can't just, and as we saw with Fukushima, the waste is not trivial. And once these sites become compromised, you're in a world of hurt for a long time. I mean, the last estimate I saw was Japan was talking about, like, I don't know what it was, like 90 or 100 years time frame for cleaning up that site. Something really just mind blowing. But so here's the thing: it has to be still, I think, part of the solution. It's like I said, it's an all the above approach that's needed, and nuclear is not perfect. But I think also the design of nuclear, I think we can do it more safely. I think we can do it more efficiently. I think we can do it in a way which reduces waste from maybe some of the earlier designs. I believe in nuclear, not as like a dream sort of energy source that I'm all passionate about, but as a necessary complement to, the scattershot of options we need to consider.
Thank you.
No, I got three questions. One for you personally, Jamie, and then two about oceans. Do you recall what Science magazine said is the principal factor that could be done to reduce climate change? I'll answer it for you.
Answer it for me.
It was have one fewer child or fewer children, because you mentioned it with women, but population is a very important factor in this. Now, a couple of ocean questions. With regard to fixing CO2 in the ocean some way in algae, I believe the main problem is that there's insufficient nutrients for the algae. And I remember reading 10, 15 years ago about somebody trying to spread iron in the ocean.
Yep.
Is there any way of increasing CO2 take into algae in the ocean? And my last question, because you can put them all together, is you never mentioned electrical generation from ocean energy.
Mm-hmm.
I've read a couple of articles on that. Could you comment on that, as you're an ocean expert?
Sure. So I'll guess population, first of all, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and if you look at Drawdown, one of their key solutions for climate change is actually women's education around the world, and women's health and reproductive health. So that, again, so that they're empowered and they're having fewer children. So absolutely agree on that one. On the ocean fertilization for algae, that's actually
or any other method to
or kelp or other things. There's a lot of it's an exciting new area of research. The venture capital folks are all over it. They're throwing a lot of money. There's a big test facility off of Australia. My lab is actually, there's a marine-based carbon dioxide removal program that's just getting started, which is trying to get more funding from the US government to study this, because we don't really know. We don't really know how to do this at a scale which is going to be meaningful in terms of addressing the problem. But yes, that's an active area of research. The third thing about ocean energy, I didn't mention this because, well, I think solar and wind are kind of the biggies, but then there's a lot of other areas of energy, like, for example, wave energy. And actually off the coast of Oregon, the Department of Energy has created this huge test facility off the Oregon coast, off Newport. It's called the Packwave facility, and it's basically a test grid of wave energy turbines, which are out there. They're either floating or they're tethered to the bottom, that we're now doing testing on to see what kind of environmental impacts those have on the local marine life. And so what kind of, whatever, planning and what kind of maybe rules or requirements we need to put in place to protect marine life in those scenarios. There's lots of other ways that we can get energy from the ocean as well. I would say a lot of those are experimental, and a lot of those are not yet scalable. That doesn't mean that they're not going to become scalable. I mean, I think wave energy is huge, but I think some of these things are going to be context specific. You can't put them everywhere. So it's going to be a question of, I really think in the future, I mean, in addition to having these super grids that move power across great distances, it's going to be a lot of kind of decentralized and devolved kind of energy generation, where you've got, locally kind of viable, locally appropriate tech that's generating energy on site. So a lot of your energy is going to be more locally sourced than what you see today. So I just think that's a little bit of an add-on to that, but Yep.
I've got one area of questioning. There's my first boss at Procter & Gamble told me, he said, Ken, never take both feet off the ground at the same time. And that's probably my most remembered and most often applied bit of learning over the years. Now, we've got great ideas here, and I'm a systems engineer, so I look at really big picture stuff and understand technology. The one thing that's missing in your presentation, which is fabulous, it's more information than I ever got, is the consideration on the economic engine that supports our ability to change. And I see that right now as one of the biggest problems, that we all want to rush into this with such a hurry that we're going to sink the economic engine and suddenly cripple our ability to do what's necessary. And
Right.
the sad thing to me is politics is behind this.
Right.
I believe is really ignoring that, because there's political things going on that are really counter to everything we're trying to do. Anyhow, by keeping at least one foot on the ground, there's a whole group of people that could come on board. Certainly, yeah, I haven't been a global warming supporter simply because I don't like these man-made solutions on how we all have to change. But yet we've got a job to do. So getting everybody together rather than splitting, I think would help. But the economics are key, so I'm interested.
Yeah, I'll just really quickly comment on that. Fully on it, and agree with that. I didn't speak much to the economics of it. A couple things. Well, first, we have to be honest with ourselves, right? That it's going to be expensive. So this conversion to a whole new energy regime is not cheap. But I think what needs to be thought about here is the cost of inaction, which one could easily argue in the face of potentially catastrophic sea level rise, forcing a managed retreat from our coastlines globally. Just start to imagine moving Los Angeles inland, or whatever it is you want to think about. Think of the costs of that.
Yeah, we have that problem up in the Great Lakes here with flooding. 2017, 2019, the Great Lakes are still full. So we can see those kind of problems.
So the point is, the cost of action is high. No one's denying that. But the cost of inaction, I think, will far dwarf, especially the longer you wait. I think that point I made earlier about, the more time we can inject into the equation here, the better for us. Because if you have to manage a retreat from the coast, it's much better to do it over 100 years than over 10 years, right? And so we need to buy ourselves that time. I also think, you have to think both long and short term in this thing, because you've got to get those early wins going. You've got to get the efficiency improvements done. You've got to do the things which really do not require a huge capital investment, right? And that pay for themselves kind of thing. You've got to get those short-term things going now, not just because they make a difference, but because they also give us momentum for the longer term, more decadal scale changes that are needed to eventually achieve that conversion to a new energy economy, which is going to take decades, right? It just is, but I think there's a myth that well, there's two myths. One is that, we can't afford it. The answer is we can afford it. It's about priorities. How we spend our resources today is frankly abominable. Like the way that we subsidize industries and subsidize things that don't need subsidies, and B, are doing bad things to society that we in turn are paying for again in terms of the impacts of that. And so we are paying like 3 times for things that we shouldn't be paying for in the first place. And so think if we took all of those resources, and that's just one tiny example, and turn them on this, and turn them on research and R&D to like ramp up the tech and ramp up the, the ability to engineer our way into a new future. So I just think it's a question of will. It's a question of political will. And we don't fully have it yet. So we do need the R&D. Like, we don't have the ability to like suddenly suck all the carbon out of the air and lock it up. We can't do that yet on a scale that's going to make a difference. But we have promising technologies that are pointing us in that direction. that we can throw some money at and I think really start to make progress with, but it is going to take resources. I do think you have to incentivize this, and I think there's lots of ways to incentivize it. I think some of it has to be top down, just mandates and laws like you saw in Iowa, which had an amazing dramatic in a red state. They were like, oh my God, yes, of course we'll do this. But I think a carbon tax is a phased in carbon tax over time, which is basically coming up with, a way to hit all the carbon generation and have that hit basically the market. The market will respond. The market always responds. When gasoline hit $4 again in this country, people stopped driving as much because they were starting to feel it. And I'm not saying I want to inflict pain on the US consumer, right? The consumers around the planet, but there's also other ways for the government to kind of soften that blow. But the point is that we can do this. Like, we know how. It really is mustering the leadership and the political will to make it happen.
Is there political will in China? Because to me, they are the biggest sinner here.
Yeah, China is such an interesting case. It really is. They're the biggest sinner and they're the biggest winner, honestly, in the renewables market. I mean, I'm going to say this, they've stolen, and they're probably listening to us. They've stolen a lot of tech from the United States. They've a lot of the R&D that we did in the 70s during the energy crunch and conservation era. Denmark took it and ran with it and created an incredible wind energy economy in their country. China has taken it and continued to take it, and not just for wind, but for solar and for. So the point is that China is like, and they're doing it because they're smart, right? They know the future, but they're playing it both ways. They're still playing catch up. They're still playing catch up with the West in terms of, we think China is like an equal superpower with us. It's really not. I mean, GDP, they might be making a lot of stuff and they might be swimming in wealth for a veneer of their society, but underneath they don't have the depth that we have in a lot of Western countries. And so they are still playing catch up is my point. So they are burning fossil fuels as quickly as they can to grow their economy and invest those resources. But the thing is, they have this top down, this communist, whatever, one party state that makes the decisions. And imagine a one party state in this country that had its mind set on strategic advantage, global strategic advantage in certain key, areas. I mean, that's what they're doing there. And that's what we're not doing here. So we won't be able to do it in the same way, but we also have other advantages in terms of innovation and R&D that position us well. I'm not saying like we're getting in some sort of like a tech race with China, but I'm totally with you on China. You kind of, you triggered something in me by mentioning China. But I mean, and I'm not anti-China necessarily. I do think they're playing us. I mean, there's documented evidence of them stealing from us. Industrial espionage is a real thing. I think Zoom calls are frankly espionage, but that's okay. I mean, that's the world we're in, and we need to play smart, and we need to get in that Shark Tank and compete with them and make it happen.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jamie.
I can't understand if someone's asking a question. I can't understand it. Sorry.
There was bad audio there.
Okay, I think we're there. Thank you so much again.
You bet. My pleasure.
Great, Jamie. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.